Too loud.
There
Thanks
it
for reminding me. I cannot wait to get back in touch with everybody, literally. Okay. Here's my announcement. Sorry, my computer's doing some weird stuff. I'd like to thank Courtney Curtolo. She is going to be taking the helm of the vocational committee. She and I have a discussion after this. So I'm pretty excited about that. We still need chairpersons for the highway cleanup committee and the membership co-chair position. So if that moves you, I'd love to hear from you. We had I pulled together an ad hoc fundraising committee meeting, brainstorming meeting last week. Asked a few people to attend. We came up with a few ideas. We're fleshing them out, but they will be online fundraisers for us. And they're different. They're things we haven't done before, things that we necessarily haven't seen in this area. So I think it's going to be interesting. So we'll be in touch about that. I misinformed you last week about the golf tournament. I gave you the wrong date for next year. It's June 7th. So if you're a better reader than I am, you would have noticed that in your email. It's June 7th, not June 21st. Lastly, I will be sending out the survey that I told you about for the in-person meeting so we can get everybody's thoughts on that and come to consensus. So that survey will be going out in the next day or two to you. I will email it. If you are uncomfortable answering it online, it's going to be Survey Monkey. So it's just, the screen comes up, the questions come up, you say yes, you say no, you give your thoughts, you move on. 5 questions total at the most. But if that is uncomfortable for you, which is fine, feel free to call me, and we'll just go through the questions over the phone. I don't want everybody's thoughts on that. We will continue on Zoom meetings in addition to the in-person meetings. So if you're comfortable with that, or you don't want to go out yet, that's fine too. Just want you to know that. Are there any other announcements from anyone? No. Okay.
Actually, I have
What?
2.
Yeah? Yeah, okay, sure.
My first one is the Zoom meetings going forward. If anybody is interested in assisting with those once we go live, I'd be happy to teach you how to do it so that I don't have to do it all by myself. So that's kind of a little subcommittee. So keep that in mind if you'd be willing to just run the Zoom meeting so that Joni can focus on what she's doing once we get back together. And the second thing is Anna has a leaving date now. It's been a struggle, and we owe a big debt of gratitude to Callie Dawson for keeping track of all of this. She's going to be leaving on August 12th. First, we thought she was going to have to stay until September 23rd, but they've made some arrangements. And with the money that she got back from the USA trip, she can use it to help pay for a trip earlier to get her home. So I believe she's going to be leaving Buffalo early in the morning on the 12th of August. So, and hopefully I'll get her back to a meeting before she goes. So that's it for me.
Joni? Hello, Joni. Can you hear me? Joni?
Oh, sorry, I was muted on my phone.
Did you ask the hotel about special needs lunches? Like Lisa, you know, is a vegetarian.
Yep.
And oh, yep. So they will provide?
Yep.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep. They met all our requirements, except they haven't heard about the HEPA filter yet for
Gotcha.
the ventilation. So I'm going to catch up with them. All right. Well, I see our speaker is here. Yay! It's not going to be a super short meeting. Let's see. Jim, there you are. Where's my face? Jim Smith is going to introduce our speaker. So again, I ask you to mute all of you. Mute yourselves.
How do I do that?
Except Jim, you don't mute you. And welcome our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Joni. I'd like to introduce John. John was born in Los Angeles, California. John has his BA in History and Philosophy from Trent University. He also has an MA in History, specializing in international relations from the University of Toronto. And he also has his PhD at the University of Toronto. He's received a certificate in archival practice from George Brown College in Toronto. John's been the archivist and historian for the Chautauqua Institution since June 2002. I asked him to send me a little information, background information, and I'm going to share some of this with you, some really special comments I'm anxious to tell you. Anyhow, in the past, he's been director of records management. He's been a private consultant for corporate archives, the sole instructor for the certificate course in records management. He has been the author of several well-forgotten articles and the co-author of the Chautauqua Institution, A Postcard History 2011. John has participated in several documentaries, including PBS Chautauqua, An American Narrative, CBS Building a Global Network, CBS Sunday Morning, NPR Radio, Voice of America, and on several occasions on local radio and television programs. He's been involved with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which I'm familiar with, for 29 years. He's a Sunday school teacher for St. Mary's in Mayville. I understand that he is an excellent bartender, but a very bad trombone player in a very bad Dixieland band. John is married and has 2 daughters. He lives in Mayville. And so we are really very happy to have you here with us today, John Schmitz. Thank you. I would like to begin our conversation by asking a couple questions, actually just one question, but it's a 3-part question. And then I'll have Joni take over and she will continue the conversation with you. So my question is, tell us how the Oliver Archives Center came about, and then how did you come to be at the archivist at Chautauqua? And as the archivist, what are your responsibilities and duties for the Oliver Archives Center? John?
Thanks. Well, I came here because I knew of Chautauqua from studying American history. Basically, that was the circuit Chautauqua was, but I was familiar with it. So when I was doing my certificate course for in archives, I created a fantasy archives as an assignment called the Chautauqua Archives. And then when I came to teach that course, I then turned that into an assignment for my students. One of my students was coming to Chautauqua regularly. This was in Toronto. And so he said they were looking for an archivist. I contacted Dick Reddington, and we worked out a consultation that I would do, and then later was hired. So that's how I came here by chance. And because I didn't even know that Chautauqua still existed, actually. I thought it had ended in the 1930s. And then when I was here, and part of the main point of the consultation was to establish the need for an archives building. We used to be in the basement of Smith that was always at risk of flooding, had mold trouble, et cetera, and didn't have a lot of space. So we looked for a facility. We found what was the opera rehearsal building. Originally, it was a carriage house, later the bindery, later the wood shop, et cetera. That is where we're in now. It was a perfect location because we were right on the edge. So we opened out into the public and we opened in to the grounds. It had ground level access on 2 levels. It was a good size. We added on a storage area for the CLSC banners, Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle banners. And we worked out the plan. I produced the specs for the building, and then operations went out to get bids on it. And then we needed to find financing. And the Oliver family offered to do it. We were hoping to get actually half the money that they ultimately gave, but we got a startup donation, very generous startup donation from the Cornell family, so we could get going right away. And then the Olivers came through with $1 million to renovate the building and create the archives that are there now. It's a very good facility. It's there are 3 separate spaces with controlled environments that we have paper storage, we have the reading room and the banner room. And it's now getting on in years, but it's holding up extremely well. And because it's not so large, the environment actually is better than the environment would be in, say, the National Archives or Library of Congress. Oh, so what do I do? Yeah, so basically I'm a corporate archivist, which means that I work for the institution. The records we hold at the Oliver Archive Center are the property of the institution, although we have them, almost all of them are open to the public, and almost all of them we consider to be in public domain, even if they aren't. So, but I primarily collect the record of what we do at Chautauqua. That's administrative records. It's also publications and announcements, etc. And I also collect several private collections of papers, such as we have the Miller family papers. We have quite a few of Vincent's papers, which we've worked in coordination with SMU, because they have actually the bulk of the records. So we work together on that. But we have also some other private individuals who have given us their records. So basically we have printed materials, published materials, theses, essays, collected reference files, which are not really archives. We have private papers and administrative records. Oh, and then I sweep up the place too. I do the cleaning on the building, monitor the building, and I spend a lot of time dealing with the public, dealing with researchers, sometimes who come, sometimes I'm doing it on telephone or online. And I also do a lot of presentations, public speaking, and I also put together a heritage lecture series of 18 to 20 lectures. This year, because we're online, there are only 9 in the series. And so we do that every summer. These cover topics. Originally, it was started that these were to cover topics relating to the history of Chautauqua. However, I found some very good speakers who are willing to come speak, and all of our speakers speak for free. We have no budget for this series. And so we broadened it to being about history in general, anything that was good. But there's also a bit of an emphasis on looking at different approaches to history, different methods used in history. And basically the principle is that we believe that just Chautauqua has something to do with just about everything. And just about everything has something to do with Chautauqua. So we've had lectures on the Second Temple. We've had lectures on various commodities in history, etc. And that takes a lot of time as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. John, I know that David had a question. David Troxel, do you want to ask your question? Oh,
Unmuted
wait.
now. Okay. Can you hear me,
There you
John?
Yep.
My question is, I go to Chautauqua a lot. I go there for the summers. I've been doing that for probably at least a decade. And I've heard about that the original electrification of that campus was undertaken by Thomas Edison. I just want to know if you had any information about that. How did it start? Where was the plant? Was it coal fired, et cetera, et cetera?
It was coal fired. It was not done by Thomas Edison. The electrification began before any involvement by him, but to a limited extent, and it never did have anything to do with him. The interesting thing is that Thomas Edison never did much at all at Chautauqua. This was more Mina's place, his wife,
Okay.
who was very involved with Chautauqua. He instead just kind of came. He never used Chautauqua to promote any of his industries. Most surprising, in my opinion, is that he never used Chautauqua to promote his filming I mean, he had a number of films that could have been played. He didn't seem to want to do that. He seemed to want to stay out of it. But as far as the electricity goes, he had no hand in it.
So can you tell us a little bit about the early electricity and how that happened? Did everybody get it at once, or?
Oh, no. There was a small generator down by the lake that was supplying energy for some lamps. Like in Miller Park, there was a lamp. Later, they set up one, Hall of Philosophy. But also there was some electrification in the hotel. Very limited until we get into the first decade of the 20th century. And some cottages would start to introduce electrification. So it didn't happen just right across the board as something that was being offered. No.
All right.
Yeah. Now, John, oh yeah, go ahead, David.
Just one more question. Chautauqua obviously existed long before there were automobiles in general use. So were there like horse stables and people, where did they keep horses? If you had a carriage there, did you have to call up, but you couldn't call up, so you had to walk down to the stable and say, please send my horse up to my house? Or how did that all work?
Well, that's a good question because I don't know the answer. Yes, there were a lot of people that came by horse. And there was a place for the horses, and you had to pay for them to be put up while you were there. It was originally in 1874 the same price as a gate pass for your horse. It was $1,
Yeah.
So you had to pay for that as well. And but how they exactly managed getting from there to their place isn't exactly clear. I think it probably is reasonable to assume, I have not seen anything that clearly explains how that's done, that they would take their wagons and on certain streets, they would go down to their cottage and then go back to the grounds to put up their carriage and their horses. So, and that area, by the way, is located just next to where the archives is today. But in terms of seeing exact schedules, rules, procedures, I've wondered that myself. I have not seen that. There was some concern with when they did start putting in wires and bringing on wagons, but mostly that would be assembly owned wagons. Now those too went through the grounds, making deliveries, picking up dirty bedpans, whatever, and dumping it in the lake, doing all that sort of function. So there were quite a few assembly vehicles that were going around as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Anyone else have a question for John before we move on? Oh, there's Mike. Go ahead, Mike. You're unmuted as far as I can tell. Wait, Mike, I can't hear you. There you go. Wait, Mike, can you unmute yourself? Anybody know how to unmute on an iPad?
No. Maybe you can write it on a paper and hold it up.
On the iPad, if you touch the screen, the unmute button should show up just like it does on a laptop or a regular screen.
Touch the screen, Mike. Touch the screen. No? You can send me a chat and I'll read it. Wait, he disappeared. Okay. I'll carry on and then Mike will maybe pop up. Some of the questions that, thank you, Greg Jones submitted were, what U.S. presidents have visited and spoken at Chautauqua? It's a common question, John, I'm sure.
Yeah. In fact, in the online heritage lectures, some of them have an ending session, Ask the Archivist, and in a couple of weeks or so, I think that's the question that we're going to be looking at, are the presidents at Chautauqua, but I'll give you sort of the rundown. The short answer is 5. Okay, now many people say, well, there were 9. So we have to make something clear to begin with. In history, we don't give someone a title until they have it. We don't refer to the person with the title until they have it. So, for instance, Winston Churchill was a war correspondent in South Africa. We don't call him Sir Winston. If we don't talk about President Washington chopping down the cherry tree, it would be very confusing if we started talking about President John Kennedy picked President Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president, or Father Baker from Buffalo wanted to be an altar boy. I mean, so we usually don't use the term at all until the person acquires it. So there were another 4 people who went on to be president who spoke at Chautauqua. But there were only 5 people with the title president who came to Chautauqua. And among those, only 4 came during the season, because Bill Clinton came as president, but that was out of the season. Now he came before on his campaign, but as president, and he spoke here as governor, but as president, he only came in the off season and never spoke here. Also, President Hayes came here and spoke. That was after he was Ulysses Grant came here in 1875, but he didn't speak. So basically what we have is 5 presidents come. Grant in 75, Hayes in 92, that's 18. Teddy Roosevelt in 1905, he was here before as governor and other things. Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, he too had been here before, but before being president. And Bill Clinton in 1996, but in the off season. And for those who would go on to be president, we had Garfield here in 1880 in his campaign. We had McKinley here in 1895, who was a friend of Lewis Miller. And that was a year before he got the nomination. We have Taft here in 1904 when nobody was thinking he'd be president. And similarly, Gerald Ford here in 1965, minority leader, before anyone was thinking he was president. So there were 5 presidents. 4 who would go on to be president also spoke here.
Okay.
Oh,
Great.
there's another thing too. We could argue about what does it mean to speak here, but basically that's the truth. 3 of those spoke in the amphitheater, and as a result, when one hears that Chautauqua was the platform of presidents, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, okay? Because we really only had 3 presidents speak in the amphitheater, and only 2 of those were acting presidents when they spoke. And sometimes people complain that, you know, I say things like this, I must be against Chautauqua. Nothing at all. It's very important we deal with the truth, right? That's partly what we're supposed to be doing, period. But also, if you don't, and then people find out what the truth is, it makes us look really, really silly. And it's not that hard to find out the truth. So I think it's best to stick with it. But the other thing is too, I raise things like this from time to time because I don't, and this isn't really an historical opinion, this is my opinion, I really don't think Chautauqua does itself good service when it gets too caught up in the celebrity culture. These are the big names we got. Well, these big names and presidents, they go everywhere. I mean, all sorts of places get celebrities speaking in them. That doesn't make a place interesting or important. And what makes Chautauqua important is being what it is, which is very unique. And it shouldn't lose that so much in boasting about things, especially when the boasting isn't even true.
All right. Speaking of maybe not true, I got a question here from Mike Moots. Thanks for the chat answer, Mike. He says, fact or myth, Athenaeum Hotel windows reach to the floor to allow Edison to escape from unwanted visitors.
I doubt it. This was very common style. It was there before Edison really was that involved at all. And I don't know, yes, they used to open the windows and you used to be able to walk onto the porch through the windows. You can do that in the colonnade too.
You do it, the sentence in Jamestown.
There you go. It was very common. I
Yeah.
don't know that, though the purpose of it was to allow Thomas Edison to sneak out or something. After all, it would be almost more of a risk to encounter all the people on the porch. At least the people in the restaurant would be sitting down, you know, when you wanted to come and leave. But also, the Edison table, as they said, it was not the Edison table, it was the Miller table. It was the Miller family table. And because Edison married Lewis Miller's daughter and was therefore Lewis Miller's son-in-law, when he was at Chautauqua, Mina and Thomas would join the family at the family table.
Here's a question, it's number 3 that I sent you. What do you consider the most treasured piece in the collection and why?
Well, that sounds like a museum curator's question. In archives, we don't really have.
You can identify, you can quantify treasured any way you want.
Okay, because we don't really have pieces. We have holdings of records we call fond from a certain creator, of et cetera. But we also deal in series of records, and it's the series of records which becomes valuable for research and for being authentic, an authentic source of information. The context is given as well. And so of the records like that we have, the most commonly used would be the dailies. It's the best record of what actually happened. And it also is a record of what was supposed to happen, but it's more reliable than the preseason schedules, et cetera. And it also describes what's going on. Now, it doesn't cover everything. And towards the end of the 19th century, in fact, it didn't even cover the whole season, which can lead to confusion. But that's the most commonly used. When I came, over 90% of the use of the archives was with the dailies. Now it's 40% or less of the total use, which is a good thing. I mean, it means people are using other records as well, but it clearly is the most valuable. That's why it took priority in our preservation strategy. Without it, we wouldn't know very much at all about really what was going on at Chautauqua. There are other sources.
We have consistent records.
Pardon?
You certainly wouldn't have a consistent record like that is.
No, and but you get just so much there. So that I would have to put there. But by the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle as a required reading is a very, very rich record because it deals with so many subjects of the day, from German naval rearmament to progressive movements and civil service reform to segregation and education. So many topics are covered in that. It really shows a progression of sort of a class, of a development of a class consciousness of what the world was like. So that's very important. But of course, too, you've got the administrative records as much as we have them. And I'll anticipate the other question. Where are we weakest? Well, certainly the most frustrating would be with our administrative records because there are many gaps. And in many cases, even when there aren't gaps, the records are very thin. They're not very rich in content. Many of the minutes of the board we have just are not very complete. So, and the reason for that, this was a summer place. So people would take their records home, and sometimes that would be at the end of it, or it also was not what was the main occupation of so many people who were in the administration. They had other lives, and this was just something they were doing in the summer, an important thing. But it wasn't until later that it became, the record became more complete, and that was when administrative offices began to be built and maintained so that the records remained here, and there was somewhat more of a continuity. Then there were some fires, but basically, often it's frustrating that we don't have better, more complete, more consistent administrative records. By the way, though, another record that we have that is extremely valuable, we're talking weeklies that were published in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. They're full of news about the administration, about the programming, but also about the local area, which makes them extremely useful. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get the money to digitize them. We're hoping to do that because that will really make them available. Otherwise, obviously less so. Then we have several very good private papers that are used quite a bit by researchers. We're still developing those. We're still receiving them. We're still finishing up several inventories. So all of that's, the more we can get the inventories done, the descriptive aids there, and more we can get online of things that ought to be online, the more it will start to come together. And that's really what we're trying to do, so that one of our purposes is to restore Chautauqua to the national memory, because it has been so forgotten. Having once been a household word, it's now, most people have never heard of it. And the best way to do that, besides through advertising, marketing, et cetera, but is to provide records that academics, researchers, journalists can easily go to. And they will incorporate it then, not just in studying about Chautauqua, but they might be studying about the history of tennis or teaching Shakespeare. If they can use our records, that will increase in awareness.
That goes along with a question that Dan Overcast just sent me. He asked about the role of technology in your position.
Well, it's vital, of course, like it would be anywhere. But when you're dealing with things certainly such as printed material, word search is really, really, really important. You have full text search, you have indices using search terms, which is also very important still. These allow you to go through, decades and decades of printed materials that you otherwise would be spending years doing. So for instance, once we had the dailies digitized and the magazines digitized, et cetera, I was able to put together a history of Catholics at Chautauqua, of Jews at Chautauqua, et cetera, which I never would have been able to do without them being digitized. At the same time, though, some people have the idea that everything should be digitized. That's a huge mistake. Digitization is expensive to do, and it's expensive to maintain. And just across the board, throw it through a scanner, and then we'll search it is a horrible approach. And you're going to end up probably losing more things. You have to pick the things that should be digitized. And that means that there's a need for multiple users using it. There is a need for remote access. There is a need for easy copying. There's a high use of those records. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones that should be digitized. If you have records that are only used once every 3 years, it's a bad idea to waste the resources and have to maintain something like that into the future. And then, of course, too, when you digitize, it's a preservation step because you're not using and wearing out the original. But never does the digital copy or any copy replace the original.
Yes, that's right. Well, we have time for one more question. Is there anybody in the group who'd like to ask another question or ask a question? You can send it to me. Whoop, there we go. David wrote, does the archive keep recordings and video?
No. We don't, because we can't. This has been proposed many, many times that we keep all of the recordings we have of all of the lectures and presentations. This would be possible, but when I go through and explain how this needs to be done, and then we start looking at the cost, it suddenly goes off the table. It's just not a practical thing to do. The other thing is that you have to be clear on what it is you want to keep and why. If, for instance, our marketing department wants to keep these recordings because they want to use them in their marketing effort, That does not require archiving. They can just keep their recordings that they want to use and so forth. But if we are going to really archive them, you do have to go by the procedures of how to do that, and that's very difficult. So we'd have to select. And then people start saying, well, yeah, let's just select the big ones, the good ones. Probably not such a good idea, because if we have, again, a celebrity coming to speak, that person's probably spoken many places, might have restrictions on how that can be replayed. But what about somebody who's not as well known? That might be more interesting, except there too, how often is that record going to be accessed? I mean, you're going to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to provide a record that's going to be used once every 20 years. Is that the best way to be spending the money? Also, if you're doing audio, that's one thing. But if you're doing audio visual, it really complicates it. It really makes it more expensive. Do you need to see the person? It's nice. Is it nice? Do you need to hear the person? That's even nicer. But still, the best way for recording most of these things is with a text. Texts are easier not only to store and preserve, but they're so much easier to search and to find out. Moreover, the truth of it is, everyone says, oh, it'll be so great to see these things and listen to these things. The truth of it is that researchers do not like real-time records. Nobody wants to sit down and have to listen to an hour lecture when you could skim through it. I mean, not even with a search. I mean, read it, skim through it, in what, 5-10 minutes to look for what it is you're looking at. So people prefer to have, whether they know it or not, they prefer to have textual records. So that is often actually a better way to go. So you have to weigh the costs, the demand, how this is going to be used. As a result, we do take DVDs and VHSs even, et cetera, and a variety of digital files, but I don't consider them to be archived. They are on the shelf or on a server, but I'm not promising that they're going to be there in 10 years.
Okay, thank you. So are you excited for next year? We actually get to do everything in person?
Well, we hope so.
I know.
Well, it's just been so different. It's hard to really compare. This has been an entirely different season, but it's interesting because we've been doing the same thing, but very, very, very differently, or many of us have. So it's been good practice. Now, we've all learned a lot having to take our program online. It's obviously not the best way to do a lot of our programming. Some of it's fine, but I mean, a lot of it is not the right way to do it. Plus, Chautauqua has to be a physical place with a physical gathering. This really is a substitute. And I'm hoping that the result will be that people will appreciate Chautauqua even more for not having had that physical assembly this year.
I think we're going to appreciate a lot of things. Thank you very much, John. We appreciate your time and your willingness to do this kind of fly-by-night. And thank you. And a donation will be made in your name to the Rotary Foundation for the Polio Plus program, which is working very hard to eliminate polio around the world. And we're very close, this close, as they like to say. So there'll be a donation made for that program in your name. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week, you're welcome. Next week, thank you. Yes, clap. Pumpkin here, so can't. Thank you, Jim, for your work this month for the program. We appreciate it very much, or I appreciate it very much. Next week, our presenter is Christina Cardinale. If that said the right way, Cardinale. Becky, you're muted, but Becky lined her up. She's candidate for the New York Assembly, opposing our own Andrew Goodell. So thank you. Have a great week. Stay cool, and I'll be in touch with the survey. Bye-bye, everybody.